Please pretend you're my dad. A little black girl told a Hell's Angel. What he did shocked all. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The late afternoon sun hung low over a dusty highway outside Phoenix, Arizona, painting the desert sky with deep orange light. Inside a small roadside diner called Copper Rail, the smell of grilled burgers and fresh coffee drifted through the air while a quiet country song played from an old radio behind the counter. At the far end of the diner sat a group of bikers wearing worn leather vests marked with the familiar patch of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. They had ridden for hours through heat and desert wind, their Harley motorcycles lined up outside like a row of black metal horses resting after a long ride. Most of the customers kept their distance, sneaking curious glances at the riders but pretending not to stare. Among the bikers sat Marcus Hayes, a tall man with broad shoulders, gray threaded through his dark beard, and calm eyes that carried the quiet weight of someone who had seen too much of the world. Marcus had spent years riding highways across the country, and there was very little that surprised him anymore. That was why he noticed immediately when the front door of the diner burst open with a loud chime of the hanging bell. A small girl hurried inside, breathing hard as if she had been running for a long time. She looked about 8 years old, her braids slightly loose, her small sneakers dusty from the gravel parking lot. Her eyes moved quickly across the room until they landed on the group of bikers. For a moment she hesitated, fear written across her face. Then she walked straight toward Marcus. The conversations at the biker table slowly faded as the child approached. When she reached Marcus, she grabbed the edge of his leather vest with both trembling hands. Her voice was barely louder than a whisper, but every biker at the table heard her words clearly. She said, "Please pretend you are my dad." The table fell completely silent. Marcus blinked in surprise, studying the girl carefully. Her name, he would later learn, was Amaya Brooks. At that moment, all he saw was a frightened child whose eyes were shining with the kind of fear that no child should ever carry. Marcus leaned slightly closer so he could speak softly without drawing attention from the rest of the diner. He asked her what was wrong. Amaya did not answer right away. Instead, she glanced nervously toward the large front window that looked out over the gravel parking lot. Marcus followed her gaze. Outside, a dark pickup truck had just rolled into the lot and stopped near the diner entrance. The engine shut off. The driver door opened slowly. A tall man stepped out and looked directly toward the building. Amaya squeezed Marcus's vest tighter as her voice trembled again. She quietly said, "That man cannot see me sitting alone." Marcus felt the shift immediately. Something was very wrong, and every instinct he had learned from years of riding with his brothers told him the same thing. The little girl sitting beside him was asking for protection. Marcus did not move right away. Years of riding across thousands of miles of American highways had taught him something important about danger. Real trouble rarely announced itself with loud threats. It arrived quietly, hidden in small moments like this one. A frightened child, a trembling voice, eyes that kept watching the door. Marcus rested one calm hand over Amaya Brooks' small hands where they clutched his leather vest. His voice was steady and low, so only she could hear him. He asked gently who the man outside was. Amaya swallowed hard. Her eyes filled with tears that she tried very hard not to let fall. She whispered that the man was her stepfather. His name was Daniel Brooks. She said the words like someone afraid that even speaking his name might somehow bring him closer. Marcus lifted his eyes toward the front window again. Outside the diner, the tall man stood beside the dark pickup truck. Daniel Brooks scanned the parking lot slowly, like a hunter looking for movement. The desert wind pushed dust across the gravel and rattled a loose metal sign hanging near the door. Marcus could see the tension in the man's posture even from inside. The kind of tension that meant he was not simply looking for someone. He was hunting for them. At the biker table, the other riders had gone completely quiet. They had heard the girl request only moments ago, and they had watched the exchange without interrupting. One of them was a large man named Victor Delgado, who everyone in the club called Bear because of his massive build and thick black beard. Bear leaned back in his chair and followed Marcus' gaze toward the window. His voice was calm but serious. He asked quietly if everything was all right. Marcus did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked back at Amaya. The girl was still staring toward the door with the frightened focus of someone waiting for a storm to break. Marcus had seen that same look many times before in places far away from Arizona. He had seen it in soldiers who knew danger was seconds away. He had seen it in civilians trapped in violent situations. It was the look of someone who believed the next few moments might change everything. Marcus made a decision. He shifted his chair slightly and pulled the empty seat beside him closer to the table. Then he spoke in a voice just loud enough for the room to hear. He said, "Sweetheart, where have you been? Your dad has been worried about you." Amaya's eyes widened for a second as she understood what he was doing. Slowly, she slid into the chair beside him. Marcus placed his arm gently across the back of the seat in a natural protective gesture. Anyone looking at them from across the diner would believe they were father and daughter sharing dinner after a long drive. Bear caught on immediately. He leaned forward with a friendly grin and pushed a glass of water toward Amaya. He told her that it looked like she had run a mile through the desert, and she should drink some water before her food arrived. Another biker named Travis Cole, who sat across the table, chuckled softly and said that kids always got hungry after long road trips with their parents. The illusion formed instantly. To anyone watching the scene from a distance, it looked like a normal family moment at a roadside diner. But beneath the table, Marcus could feel Amaya's hands still shaking. He leaned slightly closer and spoke softly again. He asked if Daniel Brooks heard her. The girl hesitated. Then she nodded once. Marcus' jaw tightened slightly, but his voice stayed calm. He asked if the man knew she was here. Amaya whispered that she ran from the truck when Daniel stopped for gas down the road. She said he had not noticed right away. But when he did, he began searching. Marcus nodded slowly as he listened. Outside, the diner door opened. The bell above the entrance rang sharply. The room fell silent again as Daniel Brooks stepped inside. The bell above the diner door rang sharply as Daniel Brooks stepped inside. The sound seemed louder than usual, cutting through the quiet air like a warning. Several customers near the counter looked up from their plates, curious about the tall man who had just entered. Daniel Brooks stood just inside the doorway for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the dimmer light of the diner. He was a large man with broad shoulders and a hard expression that looked permanently carved into his face. His dark hair was pulled back into a tight ponytail, and a heavy work jacket hung from his frame. His boots were coated with dust from the desert road. Marcus Hayes watched the man carefully without turning his head too much. Years of experience had taught him how to observe someone without drawing attention. Daniel Brooks slowly scanned the diner from left to right. His eyes moved over the counter, the booths, the kitchen window, and finally toward the far end where the group of bikers sat. Amaya Brooks felt the moment his gaze began to move in their direction. Her body stiffened, and she gripped the edge of the table with both hands. Marcus could feel the tension travel through the small chair beside him. He shifted slightly and rested his arm more firmly behind her back in a protective posture that looked natural to anyone watching. Bear reached across the table and slid a basket of fries toward Amaya as if nothing unusual was happening. He spoke in an easy voice that carried just enough volume to sound casual. He said that the kid had better eat something before it got cold because a growing girl needed real food after a long drive across the desert. Travis Cole chuckled and added that Marcus had probably been driving too fast again and scared the poor kid half to death. A few of the bikers laughed softly. The sound filled the air around their table, creating the comfortable noise of friends sharing a meal. From a distance, it looked completely ordinary. Daniel Brooks took several slow steps into the diner. His eyes narrowed slightly as he studied the room again. Something about his expression showed that he was frustrated. He knew the girl had run. He knew she could not have gone far. And somewhere deep in his instincts, he likely knew she was close. Marcus kept his voice calm and leaned toward Amaya again. He quietly asked if Daniel Brooks knew she had escaped. Amaya nodded faintly. She whispered that when the truck stopped at the gas station, she opened the door and ran behind the building. She said she kept running until she saw the diner sign across the road. Her voice trembled again when she added that Daniel always found her when she tried to run before. Marcus listened carefully. Outside, the fading sunlight painted the gravel lot with long shadows. Inside the diner, the smell of coffee and grilled onions drifted through the air while the radio continued playing its soft country tune. The normal details of the place felt strangely calm compared to the growing tension at the door. Daniel Brooks walked slowly toward the counter, and spoke briefly with the waitress. The young woman behind the counter pointed toward the back hallway that led to the restrooms. Daniel shook his head and turned away, clearly searching the room himself. His eyes moved from booth to booth. Each second felt longer than the last. When his gaze finally reached the biker table, he paused. Marcus did not look away. He simply lifted his coffee mug and took a slow sip as if he had nothing in the world to worry about. Bear continued eating his fries. Travis leaned back in his chair. The rest of the bikers sat with the relaxed confidence of men who had spent years riding together on open highways. Amaya lowered her head slightly, pretending to study the fries in front of her. Marcus could feel her fear, but he also felt something else growing in the room now. The quiet strength of the men around the table. Daniel Brooks stared at them for several seconds. His eyes moved across the leather vests, the club patches, the calm faces of the riders. Something in his expression shifted. He had come inside looking for a frightened child. Instead, he had found her sitting at a table surrounded by men who did not look easy to push around. Still, after a moment of hesitation, Daniel Brooks began walking toward them. Daniel Brooks' boots thudded heavily against the wooden floor as he approached the biker table. Each step seemed to slow the entire diner. Conversations from other customers faded away until the only sounds left were the quiet hum of the refrigerator behind the counter and the soft country music drifting from the radio. Marcus Hayes set his coffee mug down slowly and looked up just as Daniel reached the edge of the table. The two men studied each other in silence for a moment. Daniel Brooks' face carried the tight anger of someone who believed he had already lost control of a situation. Marcus' expression remained calm, steady, almost relaxed. To someone who did not know him, it might have looked like indifference. But the bikers around the table knew Marcus well enough to recognize the quiet focus in his eyes. Amaya Brooks sat very still beside him. She kept her head lowered toward the basket of fries in front of her, but Marcus could feel the tension in her small shoulders. Daniel Brooks glanced around the table, his eyes lingering on the leather vests and the familiar red and white club patches. It was clear he recognized what he was looking at. The Hells Angels Motorcycle Club did not require introductions. Daniel cleared his throat and spoke with forced patience. He said he was looking for his daughter. Marcus did not respond immediately. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his chair and rested his arm comfortably along the back of Amaya's seat. Then he looked directly at Daniel Brooks and said in an even voice that the man must be mistaken. Daniel Brooks' eyes moved downward and landed on Amaya. For a brief second, the anger on his face sharpened. He pointed toward her and said that the girl belonged with him. Amaya flinched at the sound of his voice, but did not lift her head. Marcus' voice remained calm. He said that the girl had already told him her father was sitting right here at the table. Daniel Brooks gave a short, humorless laugh. He said that Marcus should not get involved in family business that did not concern him. Bear leaned forward slightly in his chair and rested his large arms on the table. His deep voice rumbled like distant thunder when he spoke. He said that any child who asked for help concerned everyone sitting there. Travis Cole pushed his chair back a few inches and folded his arms across his chest, studying Daniel with open curiosity. The tension in the air thickened. Daniel Brooks looked from one biker to another, clearly realizing that he was now standing in the center of a table full of men who were not easily intimidated. Still, he took another step closer. His voice dropped lower when he spoke again. He said that Amaya needed to come with him immediately and that he would not ask a second time. Marcus leaned forward slowly. His chair creaked against the floor as he shifted. The calm in his expression never changed, but there was a firmness in his voice now that made several nearby customers glance nervously toward the table. Marcus said that if Amaya wanted to leave, she was free to do so. Then he turned his head slightly toward the girl beside him and asked her one simple question. He asked if she wanted to go with Daniel Brooks. The entire diner seemed to hold its breath. Amaya's hands trembled slightly where they rested on the table. For a moment she said nothing. Then she shook her head. The movement was small but unmistakable. She whispered that she did not want to go. Daniel Brooks' jaw tightened as anger flashed across his face. He took another step forward, reaching one hand toward the back of Amaya's chair. Before his hand could get close, Marcus stood up. The motion was slow but powerful. Marcus Hayes was well over 6 feet tall and built like a man who had spent years lifting engines and riding across hard miles of American highway. When he rose from his chair, he placed himself directly between Daniel Brooks and the small girl sitting behind him. Marcus' voice was still calm when he spoke again, but the message in his words was unmistakable. He said that tonight the girl was staying right where she felt safe. Daniel Brooks' hand stopped in the air the moment Marcus Hayes stepped forward. The difference between the two men became very clear in that moment. Daniel was tall and strong, but Marcus carried the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years dealing with dangerous situations without ever raising his voice. The entire diner watched the scene unfold with growing tension. The waitress behind the counter had frozen beside the coffee machine, her eyes wide as she followed every movement near the biker table. Outside, the desert sun had dropped lower behind the horizon, and the long shadows of the parked motorcycles stretched across the gravel lot like silent guards. Daniel Brooks slowly lowered his hand, but his eyes burned with frustration. He looked over Marcus' shoulder toward Amaya Brooks. His voice came out tight and controlled. He said that the girl was his responsibility and that Marcus had no right to interfere. Marcus did not move aside. Instead, he folded his arms across his chest and stood firmly between Daniel and the chair where Amaya sat. His voice remained calm when he answered. He said that nobody had stopped the girl from speaking for herself. He reminded Daniel that she had already made it clear she did not want to leave with him. Daniel Brooks shook his head with an irritated laugh. He said that children did not always understand what was best for them, and that Amaya had a habit of creating trouble. His tone carried a sharp edge that made several people in the diner shift uncomfortably in their seats. Behind Marcus, Amaya sat very still. Her small hands gripped the edge of the table while she tried to stay quiet. Bear noticed the way her fingers trembled and the way her shoulders hunched forward as if she were trying to make herself invisible. The large biker leaned slightly to the side so he could look around Marcus. When Bear eyes landed on Amaya's arms, he frowned deeply. There was a dark bruise just below the sleeve of her shirt. The mark looked fresh and unmistakable against her brown skin. Bear straightened slowly and exchanged a glance with Marcus. Marcus followed Bear's gaze for a brief moment and saw the bruise as well. His jaw tightened slightly, but he kept his expression controlled. Daniel Brooks noticed the brief look between the bikers, and his irritation grew. He stepped closer again, trying to peer around Marcus toward the girl. His voice rose slightly when he spoke. He said that this situation had gone far enough and that he was taking Amaya home. Marcus shook his head once. His voice remained steady when he answered. He said that nobody was going anywhere until they understood what was happening. Daniel Brooks' eyes narrowed. He asked Marcus what that was supposed to mean. Marcus leaned slightly to the side, just enough to glance back toward Amaya. He spoke gently and asked her another question. He asked if Daniel Brooks had hurt her. The diner fell completely silent. Even the radio seemed quieter as the country song reached the end of its melody. Amaya looked down at the table. For several seconds, she did not move. Then her head lowered a little more, and she nodded slowly. The movement was small but impossible to misunderstand. Daniel Brooks' face flushed with anger the moment he saw the gesture. He raised his voice and insisted that the girl was lying. He said that children often made up stories when they were angry or afraid of discipline. Bear chair scraped loudly against the floor as the massive biker stood up. His towering frame added another wall of muscle beside Marcus. Travis Cole rose from his seat as well, followed by two more bikers at the table. None of them spoke right away. They simply stood there, their presence filling the small diner with a silent warning. Daniel Brooks looked around and realized that the balance of the room had shifted completely. He was no longer dealing with one man. He was facing an entire group that had already decided where they stood. Marcus looked back at Daniel one more time. His voice remained quiet, but the firmness in it carried across the room. He said that the girl had spoken and that from this moment forward things were going to be handled very carefully. Outside in the fading evening light, another motorcycle engine rumbled somewhere down the highway, echoing faintly across the desert air. The low rumble of another motorcycle engine drifted faintly through the evening air outside the diner, barely noticeable to most of the customers. But the bikers at the table heard it clearly. Marcus Hayes did not turn his head toward the window, yet he recognized the sound immediately. The deep, steady rhythm belonged to a Harley engine, and riders who had spent years on the road could identify that sound as easily as they could recognize an old friend's voice. Daniel Brooks heard it too. His eyes flicked briefly toward the diner entrance before returning to Marcus. The tension in his face tightened. He clearly realized that the situation around him was beginning to move beyond his control. Marcus stood calmly with his arms folded across his chest, still positioned directly between Daniel and the chair where Amaya Brooks sat. Bear and Travis remained standing beside him, their large frames forming a silent barrier. Around the diner, several customers had quietly pulled out their phones, pretending to check messages while secretly watching the confrontation unfold. The waitress remained behind the counter, gripping the edge of the coffee machine as if she was unsure whether she should call the police or simply stay out of the way. Daniel Brooks exhaled sharply through his nose and tried to regain control of the situation. His voice dropped into a colder tone as he spoke again. He said that Marcus and his friends were making a mistake by interfering in something they did not understand. He claimed that Amaya was a difficult child who often ran away whenever she became upset. He insisted that the bruise on her arm came from a fall earlier that day. Marcus listened without interrupting. His expression did not change, but his eyes briefly shifted toward the small girl sitting behind him. Amaya remained silent, staring down at the wooden table while her fingers traced nervous circles around the edge of the basket of fries Bear had placed in front of her. Marcus spoke again after a moment. His voice was calm but firm. He said that stories were easy to tell, but the truth was usually written in smaller details that people tried to hide. He nodded slightly toward Amaya's arm. Daniel Brooks followed the gesture and saw the bruise again. His jaw clenched. For a second, he looked as though he might explode with anger, but then he forced himself to stay still. Bear spoke next, his deep voice filling the space between the men. He said that he had seen enough in his life to recognize when a child was truly afraid. He pointed out that Amaya had run across a highway and into a diner full of strangers just to avoid going back to the truck with Daniel Brooks. Bear said that kind of fear did not come from a simple misunderstanding. Daniel Brooks' eyes moved slowly around the table again, measuring the men who now stood against him. Marcus could see the calculation happening in his mind. Daniel was beginning to understand that intimidation would not work here. But Daniel Brooks was not ready to walk away either. He leaned slightly closer to Marcus and lowered his voice. He said that if the bikers thought they were heroes, then they were badly mistaken. He warned that they did not know who they were dealing with. Marcus did not respond to the threat. Instead, he reached slowly into the pocket of his leather vest. Daniel Brooks stiffened instantly, watching the movement with suspicion. But Marcus only pulled out a small phone. He tapped the screen once and sent a short message. Then he slipped the phone back into his vest. Outside the diner, another motorcycle engine joined the first. Then another. The distant rumble grew gradually louder as more bikes approached along the highway. Inside the diner, several customers glanced nervously toward the front windows. Daniel Brooks turned his head slightly and listened. The sound of multiple engines echoed across the gravel lot now. Marcus looked directly into Daniel's eyes and spoke quietly. He said that nobody in the room wanted trouble. But until the truth about Amaya Brooks was clear, she would not be leaving with anyone who made her afraid. At that moment, the headlights of several motorcycles appeared through the front windows of the diner as riders began pulling into the parking lot outside. The deep roar of motorcycle engines outside the diner grew louder with every passing second. What had begun as a distant sound on the highway was now a powerful rolling thunder across the gravel parking lot. Headlights swept across the diner windows as the first bikes turned off the road and pulled into the lot. Inside the diner, every customer turned their head toward the glass. The quiet roadside restaurant that had felt ordinary only minutes ago suddenly felt like the center of something much larger. Marcus Hayes remained standing between Daniel Brooks and the small girl behind him, but he did glance briefly toward the window now. The glow of approaching headlights reflected across the chrome of the parked motorcycles already lined outside. Bear leaned slightly toward Marcus and spoke in a low voice that Daniel Brooks could not hear clearly. Bear said that it sounded like half the club had heard the message. Marcus nodded faintly without looking away from Daniel. Across the room, the waitress stepped closer to the counter window and peeked outside. Her eyes widened as she saw the first group of riders dismounting. Leather vests moved through the fading desert light. Boots crunched over the gravel. The riders walked toward the diner entrance with calm purpose. Daniel Brooks heard the engines shutting down one by one outside. The sound of multiple motorcycles settling into silence made the air inside the diner feel even heavier. His confidence began to crack for the first time. He looked from Marcus to Bear and then toward the window where the silhouettes of several more bikers could now be seen approaching the building. Marcus spoke again in the same steady voice he had used from the beginning. He said that nobody wanted things to escalate. He reminded Daniel that the situation could still be handled calmly if everyone focused on what was best for the child sitting at the table. Daniel Brooks forced a thin smile that did not reach his eyes. He said that Marcus was trying to scare him with numbers. But then his gaze drifted toward the entrance again as the bell above the door rang loudly. The diner door opened, and 3 more riders stepped inside. They wore the same worn leather vests and patches as Marcus and Bear. The first man through the door was tall with silver hair and a weathered face that suggested decades spent riding under open skies. His name was Raymond Carter, one of the most respected members of the local club chapter. Behind him walked 2 younger riders who scanned the room calmly before their eyes settled on Marcus. Raymond Carter approached the table slowly, removing his riding gloves as he walked. He gave Marcus a brief nod of recognition before turning his attention toward Daniel Brooks. His voice was calm, but carried the authority of someone used to leading men. He asked if there was a problem that needed to be understood. Daniel Brooks shifted his weight uneasily now. The arrival of more riders had changed the atmosphere in the room completely. The small diner suddenly felt crowded with quiet strength. Marcus gestured slightly toward the chair behind him where Amaya Brooks sat. The girl still kept her eyes down, but she glanced briefly at the new arrivals with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Marcus explained that the child had run into the diner asking for help. He said that she had claimed she was afraid to return to the man standing in front of them. Raymond Carter listened carefully. Then he crouched slightly so that he could look toward Amaya without appearing threatening. His voice softened when he spoke to her. He asked if she felt safe sitting where she was. Amaya nodded slowly. Raymond stood again and looked toward Daniel Brooks. His expression grew serious. He said that when a child was frightened enough to run across a highway and ask strangers to pretend to be her father, then something had gone very wrong long before anyone arrived at the diner. Daniel Brooks opened his mouth to argue but stopped when another engine roared briefly outside, followed by the slam of a truck door. Through the diner window, the flashing lights of a patrol vehicle appeared as it turned into the gravel lot. The flashing lights of the patrol vehicle painted the front windows of the diner with red and blue streaks that moved slowly across the walls. Outside, the gravel parking lot, which had been quiet only a short time earlier, now held a row of powerful motorcycles and a sheriff patrol truck parked beside them. The low hum of the police engine mixed with the fading warmth of the desert evening. Inside the diner, every person in the room had turned toward the windows. Some customers looked relieved while others simply looked stunned by how quickly the calm roadside stop had turned into a scene that felt larger than life. Daniel Brooks stood frozen for a moment as the flashing lights reflected across his face. The anger that had filled his expression only minutes earlier now mixed with something else. Uncertainty. Marcus Hayes watched him carefully. Marcus had already seen enough confrontations in his life to recognize the moment when someone realized they had lost control of a situation. Daniel Brooks had entered the diner believing he could simply take Amaya Brooks back to the truck and leave. Now he was standing in the middle of a room surrounded by bikers and with a patrol vehicle arriving outside. Raymond Carter glanced toward the window and then back to Marcus. His voice was calm when he spoke again. He said that it seemed someone had decided the situation should be handled properly. Marcus gave a small nod. He had already made the call earlier when Daniel Brooks first tried to reach for the girl. Marcus believed that if a child was frightened enough to run for help, then the truth needed to come out where everyone could see it clearly. The bell above the diner door rang once more as the entrance opened again. This time it was not a biker stepping inside. A uniformed sheriff deputy entered the diner, followed by another officer behind him. The first deputy was a middle-aged man with a sunburned face and a calm but serious expression. His badge read Deputy Michael Turner. He paused just inside the door and looked slowly around the room, taking in the unusual gathering of bikers and the tense silence hanging over the tables. The deputy lifted one hand in a calming gesture. His voice carried across the diner in a steady tone that suggested he had dealt with difficult situations many times before. He said that someone had called about a disturbance and he would like to understand what was happening. Marcus stepped forward slightly but kept his posture relaxed. He explained that there had been no disturbance, only concern for the safety of a child who had come into the diner asking strangers for help. Deputy Turner followed Marcus' gaze toward the table where Amaya sat. The girl looked even smaller, now sitting quietly between Bear and one of the other bikers who had pulled a chair closer to her. The deputy walked slowly toward the table so he would not appear threatening. When he reached a comfortable distance, he knelt slightly so he could speak to Amaya at eye level. His voice softened when he addressed her. He asked if she was all right. Amaya hesitated for a moment. Then she nodded slowly. The deputy noticed the tension in her posture and the way her eyes flicked nervously toward Daniel Brooks, standing several feet away. Deputy Turner stood again and turned toward Daniel. He asked if Daniel Brooks was the man who had arrived with the girl earlier. Daniel forced a confident tone when he answered. He said that Amaya was his stepdaughter and that she had run away during a stop on their drive. He claimed that the bikers had misunderstood the situation. Deputy Turner listened carefully, but his eyes briefly moved toward the bruise on Amaya's arm that was still visible beneath her sleeve. The deputy then looked back at Daniel Brooks and asked a simple question. He asked where they had been driving and why a child had felt the need to run across a highway to ask strangers to pretend to be her father. Daniel Brooks opened his mouth to answer Deputy Michael Turner's question, but the confidence he had shown earlier was beginning to crack. The flashing red and blue lights from the patrol vehicle outside continued to wash across the diner walls, turning the quiet restaurant into a place filled with tension and watchful silence. Every person in the room waited to hear what Daniel would say next. Daniel cleared his throat and straightened his shoulders as if trying to rebuild the authority he had carried when he first walked inside. He told the deputy that he and Amaya Brooks had been driving toward Nevada because he had recently accepted a construction job near Las Vegas. He explained that they had stopped for gas and that the girl had run away when he stepped inside the station for a moment. He insisted that she had always been a difficult child who sometimes created problems when she did not get her way. Deputy Turner listened quietly without interrupting. His eyes moved briefly toward Amaya again. The girl still sat between the bikers, her small hands folded tightly in her lap. Marcus Hayes stood only a few feet away, watching the exchange carefully but allowing the deputy to handle the situation. Raymond Carter remained near the table as well, his arms relaxed at his sides, but his attention fully focused on the conversation. Deputy Turner spoke again in the same steady voice. He said that if Daniel Brooks was telling the truth, then the situation would be simple to clear up. But he explained that when a child ran across a highway and asked strangers to pretend to be her father, law enforcement had to take the matter seriously. Daniel Brooks forced another tight smile. He said that the deputy could speak to Amaya and she would confirm that she belonged with him. Deputy Turner nodded and turned his attention back toward the girl. He crouched again so that his eyes were level with hers. His voice softened when he spoke to her. He asked Amaya if she understood that she was safe and that she could tell the truth without worrying about anyone getting angry with her. Amaya hesitated for several seconds. Her eyes moved briefly toward Daniel Brooks and then back toward the deputy. Marcus noticed the fear that still flickered across her face, and he spoke gently from where he stood. He reminded her that nobody in the room would let anyone hurt her. The reassurance seemed to give the girl a little courage. She took a slow breath before answering the deputy question. Amaya said that Daniel Brooks had told her they were going to Nevada, but she did not want to go because he had been hurting her for months. The quiet words seemed to echo through the diner. Daniel Brooks immediately shook his head and tried to interrupt, claiming that the girl was confused. But Deputy Turner raised his hand slightly, signaling him to stay quiet while the girl finished speaking. Amaya continued in a trembling voice. She explained that her mother had died earlier in the year and that Daniel had become angry and unpredictable after that. She said that sometimes he would shout, and sometimes he would grab her arm hard enough to leave bruises. She said she had tried to run away before, but had never been able to get far. Deputy Turner listened carefully while the room remained completely silent. When Amaya finished speaking, he stood up slowly and looked back toward Daniel Brooks. The deputy's expression had grown far more serious. He asked Daniel if there was any reason the girl would make such accusations. Daniel Brooks' face flushed red as frustration and anger returned to his expression. He insisted that the girl was lying because she did not want to move to a new state. But while he spoke, the second officer who had entered the diner earlier stepped quietly toward the door and spoke into his radio. Outside in the parking lot, more headlights appeared as another patrol vehicle pulled into the gravel lot, its emergency lights flashing across the rows of parked motorcycles. Daniel Brooks' voice rose sharply as he insisted that the girl was lying, but the sound of another patrol vehicle pulling into the gravel lot outside began to drown out his words. Through the front windows, the red and blue emergency lights flashed brighter now, reflecting across the polished chrome of the parked motorcycles and the dusty glass of the diner door. Inside the room, the tension had shifted again. What had begun as a confrontation between a frightened child and an angry man had now become a situation under the full attention of law enforcement. Deputy Michael Turner watched Daniel Brooks carefully while the second officer finished speaking into the radio near the entrance. The deputy expression had changed from cautious curiosity to quiet determination. Years of experience had taught him that frightened children rarely ran across highways and into crowded diners unless something was very wrong. Marcus Hayes stood a few feet away with his arms relaxed at his sides, but his presence remained firm and protective. Bear and Travis stayed near the table where Amaya Brooks sat, making sure she remained comfortable and safe while the deputy continued asking questions. Outside, another patrol vehicle engine shut off, and the sound of car doors closing echoed across the parking lot. Daniel Brooks seemed to realize that the situation was slipping further from his control with every passing second. He tried again to reclaim authority in his voice. He told Deputy Turner that the girl had always been dramatic and that she was trying to avoid the move to Nevada. He said that children often told stories when they did not want to follow rules. Deputy Turner did not raise his voice, but the firmness in his reply carried through the quiet diner. He said that the investigation would determine the truth and that Daniel Brooks needed to remain calm while officers gathered information. Daniel Brooks took a step backward and crossed his arms, clearly irritated but aware that arguing further would only make the situation worse. Meanwhile, the second officer walked outside briefly and spoke with the newly arrived patrol unit before returning to the diner. When he stepped back inside, he leaned toward Deputy Turner and spoke quietly for several seconds. Marcus noticed the change in the deputy expression as he listened. Something about the information had caught his attention. Deputy Turner nodded once before turning back toward Daniel Brooks. His voice remained steady, but now carried a sharper edge. He asked Daniel if there was anything he wanted to add before they continued the investigation. Daniel shook his head impatiently and said he had already explained everything. Deputy Turner studied him for a moment before speaking again. He said that the second officer had just checked the registration on the pickup truck parked outside. According to the records, the vehicle was registered under Daniel Brooks' name. But the deputy explained that there was also an alert attached to the registration number in the state system. Daniel Brooks' face tightened instantly as the words settled into the room. Several of the bikers exchanged brief glances while the deputy continued speaking. Deputy Turner said that earlier in the week another county had received a report concerning a possible welfare check for a child traveling with Daniel Brooks. The report had not yet confirmed any wrongdoing, but it had flagged the vehicle in case officers encountered it during a routine stop. The deputy paused and looked directly at Daniel. He explained that the alert had been filed after a neighbor reported hearing repeated arguments and suspected that the child living in the home might be in danger. The quiet words settled heavily across the diner. Amaya Brooks lowered her head again, but this time she did not look as frightened as before. Marcus noticed the change. For the first time since she had run through the diner door, the girl seemed to realize that the truth she had carried alone was finally being heard by people who would listen. The words from Deputy Michael Turner settled over the diner like a heavy desert wind that refused to move. The alert connected to Daniel Brooks' vehicle registration changed the entire atmosphere in the room. What had first sounded like a family disagreement now carried the weight of a possible investigation that had already begun somewhere else. Daniel Brooks stood very still near the center of the diner floor. His earlier confidence had disappeared, replaced by the tight look of someone realizing that every step he had taken that evening had brought more attention instead of control. The flashing red and blue lights outside continued to ripple across the windows, casting long shadows over the tables and the row of motorcycles parked outside. Deputy Turner kept his voice calm and measured as he continued speaking. He explained that the alert did not automatically mean a crime had been committed, but it did mean that officers were required to investigate carefully if they encountered the situation in person. The deputy then asked Daniel Brooks if he had anything he wished to clarify regarding the report filed by the neighbor earlier that week. Daniel opened his mouth, closed it again, and finally spoke in a strained voice. He repeated that the neighbor had misunderstood normal household arguments. He said that raising a child alone after the death of a spouse was difficult and sometimes emotions ran high. But even as he spoke, the strength in his voice continued to fade. Marcus Hayes stood quietly nearby, watching the exchange without interrupting. He had seen this moment many times before in different forms. When someone tried to control a situation through intimidation and anger, the truth often began to surface the moment calm authority replaced fear. Bear and Travis remained close to the table where Amaya Brooks sat. Bear had gently slid another chair closer so that the girl felt surrounded by people who meant her no harm. Amaya still looked small in the seat, but her posture had changed slightly. Her shoulders were no longer drawn inward as tightly as before. She listened to the adults speaking while slowly beginning to understand that she was not alone anymore. Deputy Turner turned his attention back toward her for a moment. His voice softened again as he spoke. He told Amaya that she had done the right thing by asking for help. He explained that sometimes adults forgot that children deserve to feel safe, and that officers like him were there to make sure those situations were handled properly. Amaya nodded quietly. Marcus could see the relief beginning to replace the fear in her eyes. Meanwhile, the second officer stepped forward and addressed Daniel Brooks directly. He asked Daniel if he would be willing to step outside and answer a few additional questions near the patrol vehicle. The request was phrased politely, but the meaning behind it was clear. Daniel Brooks looked around the diner once more, his eyes moving across the faces of the bikers who had stood against him and the officers who now watched him carefully. The balance of power had shifted completely. With a tight breath, he nodded reluctantly and walked toward the entrance. The bell above the diner door rang again as he stepped outside into the flashing lights of the patrol vehicles. Through the window, everyone inside could see the officers guiding him toward the side of the patrol truck. Marcus remained where he was for a moment before turning back toward Amaya. He crouched slightly so that he could meet her eyes without towering above her. His voice was gentle when he spoke. He told her that she had shown more courage in one evening than many adults managed in a lifetime. The girl looked up at him quietly. For the first time since she had rushed into the diner, a small spark of hope appeared in her expression as the night air outside carried the distant sound of officers beginning their careful investigation. The night air outside the diner had cooled as the desert sun finally disappeared beyond the distant mountains. The flashing red and blue lights from the patrol vehicles continued to spin slowly across the gravel parking lot, casting moving reflections over the row of motorcycles and the dusty windows of the diner. Inside, the atmosphere had begun to shift from tension toward cautious calm. Several customers who had remained frozen in their seats earlier were now quietly whispering to one another as they watched the officers outside. Through the window, Daniel Brooks stood beside the patrol vehicle while Deputy Michael Turner and the second officer spoke with him. Marcus Hayes remained near the table where Amaya Brooks sat, his posture relaxed but attentive. Bear leaned against the side of the booth with his large arms folded across his chest, while Travis Cole sat down again, giving the young girl space, but staying close enough so she would not feel alone. Raymond Carter stepped quietly toward the front window and watched the officers outside for a moment before turning back toward the group. His voice was calm when he spoke. He said that the deputies were checking Daniel Brooks' identification and the details connected to the alert in the state system. Marcus nodded slightly. He understood how these situations worked. Law enforcement needed time to confirm facts before making any decisions. Meanwhile, Amaya sat quietly in her chair, holding the glass of water Bear had placed in front of her earlier. She had barely touched the fries on the table, but the trembling in her hands had begun to fade. For the first time since she had rushed into the diner, she no longer looked like a child waiting for something terrible to happen. Deputy Turner soon stepped back inside the diner while the other officer remained outside with Daniel Brooks. The deputy removed his hat and approached the table again. His expression was serious but not unkind. He explained that the officers had confirmed the alert connected to the earlier welfare report and that they would be contacting Child Protective Services to ensure the situation was handled correctly. He told Amaya that she would not be returning to the truck with Daniel Brooks that night. The simple statement seemed to lift a weight from the room. Amaya looked down for a moment and then slowly nodded. Marcus noticed that her shoulders relaxed slightly, as if she had been holding her breath for hours without realizing it. Deputy Turner continued speaking carefully. He said that situations like this required patience because investigators needed to understand the full story before making long-term decisions. However, he assured everyone that Amaya's safety would remain the highest priority from this point forward. Outside the diner, the other officer finished speaking with Daniel Brooks and guided him toward the patrol vehicle so they could continue the discussion privately. The flashing lights continued to spin across the desert night, while the low sound of distant highway traffic drifted across the open land. Inside the diner, the tension that had once filled every corner of the room had softened into something quieter. Marcus crouched beside Amaya's chair again, so he could speak at her level. His voice carried the calm steadiness that had guided the entire evening. He told her that sometimes the hardest step in life was the moment when someone found the courage to ask for help. He reminded her that she had taken that step the moment she ran through the diner door and asked a stranger to pretend to be her father. Amaya looked up at him, and for the first time a faint smile appeared on her face. It was small and uncertain, but it carried the quiet relief of a child beginning to believe that the world might still contain people who would stand beside her when she needed it most. The desert night had fully settled over the roadside diner, and the flashing lights from the patrol vehicles now reflected softly across the gravel lot, like distant stars caught in motion. Inside the diner, the atmosphere had grown quiet again. The tension that had once filled every corner of the room had slowly faded into something calmer, something steady. Outside, Daniel Brooks stood beside the patrol vehicle while Deputy Michael Turner and the other officer continued their conversation with him. After several minutes, the deputy returned to the diner entrance and stepped inside once more. His expression carried the calm seriousness of someone who had reached an important decision. Marcus Hayes, Bear, Travis, and Raymond Carter looked toward him while Amaya Brooks remained seated at the table holding her glass of water. Deputy Turner spoke clearly so everyone could hear. He explained that Daniel Brooks would not be leaving with the child that evening. The officers had confirmed the earlier welfare report, and additional concerns would now be reviewed by Child Protective Services. Daniel Brooks would be escorted to the station so investigators could continue examining the situation and determine what had been happening inside the home during the previous months. The quiet words settled across the room with a sense of finality. Through the window, Marcus could see the second officer guiding Daniel Brooks toward the patrol vehicle. The man who had walked into the diner earlier with anger and certainty now looked smaller beneath the flashing lights as the door of the patrol truck opened. A moment later, the vehicle door closed and the engine started. Amaya watched silently through the window as the patrol vehicle slowly pulled away from the diner parking lot and disappeared onto the highway. When the lights faded into the distance, the room felt peaceful for the first time that evening. Deputy Turner turned his attention back toward Amaya. His voice was gentle as he explained that another officer from the County Family Services Department would arrive soon to help arrange a safe place for her to stay while the investigation continued. He assured her that she would not have to return to the situation she had escaped earlier that evening. Amaya listened quietly. The fear that had filled her eyes when she first rushed into the diner had almost completely disappeared. In its place, there was something new. Relief. Marcus Hayes crouched beside her chair once more. The large biker who had spent years riding endless miles across the country now spoke to the small girl with the same calm voice he had used from the very beginning. He told her that courage did not always look like strength. Sometimes courage looked like a child running into a room full of strangers and asking one simple question that changed everything. Amaya looked up at him for a long moment. Then she spoke softly. She asked if he would still pretend to be her father for just a little while longer until the other officers arrived. Marcus did not hesitate. He nodded and placed his hand gently on the back of her chair. Around them, the other bikers smiled quietly while the last customers finished their coffee and the waitress wiped the counter with slow, careful movements. Outside, the row of motorcycles stood silent beneath the desert sky, their chrome surfaces reflecting the faint glow of the diner sign. Some promises lasted only a few minutes. Others lasted a lifetime. That night, a frightened little girl had walked through a diner door and asked a stranger to pretend to be her father. What she found instead was a room full of people who refused to let her face the world alone again.